Abu Muhammad al-Jolani's history, his real name is Ahmad al-Sharra. Abu Muhammad Jolani is a name that he chose and he took to basically represent himself and his brand. Because Jolani was a militant. Al-Sharra may become the politician. They know what PR is, they know what media is, they know the power of media, they know the power of imagery.
What was the ideological problem between Al-Qaeda and Jolani?
He knew what he wanted. He read the ground as well, probably much better than everyone else. He saw this weakening of the Assad government taking place. He was imprisoned in something called Camp Bucca, which was run at that point of time, a very notorious prison of all these militants, and there he met Baghdadi.
Does this victory inspire other terrorists, other extremist groups in the region?
Jolani is not the person who's going to do elections. Israel at some level thought, you know what, a devil that you know is better than a devil that you don't know.
So let's forget democracy, let's forget good governance. Will the civil war end? Namaste and welcome to the Rising India podcast. It's been 14 years since the pro-democracy Arab Spring began in Syria. The spring that started in 2011 has turned into a dark and cold winter, but the civil war and the violence it unleashed continues till today. To put the country in context, it has an area of 185,000 square kilometers, which is less than the area of Karnataka. Its population is 25 million, that's around the population of Mumbai and Jaipur combined, 90% of who live in poverty. Its GDP in 2011 was $68 billion. 10 years later, it had crashed to $9 billion, bringing the country back to 1979 levels. Yesterday, that is on Sunday, 8 October 2024, Syrian rebels under Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham seized control of Damascus and ousted President Bashar al-Assad. President Assad has left the country. The Russian media says he's in Moscow. Mr. Abu Muhammad al-Jolani seems to be in charge. In the process of getting rid of President Assad, this seizure of the country has also impacted two countries supporting him, Russia and Iran. The change in Syria will also impact 4 Islamic countries and 1 Jewish state. Turkey to its north, Iraq to its east and southeast, Jordan to its south and Lebanon to its west and southwest, and of course, Israel to its southwest. Besides them, the United States has a presence in East Syria, which too will be affected. In Syria, therefore, we are in the middle of a geopolitical turbulence that is not only going to impact its bordering neighbors, but will also have broader ramifications in the region. Finally, as the past 3 years have shown us, wars, even when they are regional, have unintended global consequences. So how do we read this change in Syria? To decode and explain what's going on in the region and outside, I have with me Mr. Kabir Taneja. He is the Deputy Director and Fellow Middle East with the Strategic Studies Program at the Observer Research Foundation. His research focuses on India's relations with West Asia and specifically looks at the domestic political dynamics, terrorism, non-state militant actors, and the general security paradigm of the region. 6 years ago, he wrote a brilliant book called The ISIS Peril, the world's most feared terror group and its shadow on South Asia. In this 2019 book, he discussed the psychology of South Asia jihadists and their narratives from Kashmir to Kerala. Kabir is my go-to person to understand this region. Anytime anything happens there, I call him to understand the nuances. I push him to write out his analysis. He usually says the geography is a moving target, so let's wait. We fight, and finally, in 8 out of 10 times, I win. Thank you for joining us, Kabir.
Thank you so much.
Glad to have you on the Rising India podcast.
Lovely to be here.
I have only 3 sets of questions for you. But before we get there, tell us, what is your assessment of the ground situation in Syria? What does Syria look like under Mr. Jolani?
So first and foremost, it's a very complicated and fast-moving situation. It's very difficult to ascertain right now what the future is going to look like, as that is true to the larger Middle East also. Crystal ball gazing in the Middle East is a very dangerous job to get into. You are more often wrong than right. But having said that, I think big chunks of the global community, and especially the regional community in the Middle East, did not expect what has happened in Syria. I think everyone knew that President Assad is under challenge for a long period of time. But because of everything happening in Gaza, because of everything happening in Lebanon, the Israel-Iran rivalry sort of taking center stage, the Syrian part was almost brushed under the carpet for some time. I think people preferred to ignore it and not look at that part right now because there were bigger sort of
So all
problems.
this while, whatever was happening about 4-5 years ago was continuing.
Absolutely.
And it was just not...
It had just become a status quo. Right. So, yes, there were no direct sort of challenges to President Assad's tenure in Damascus. But about 4-5 years ago, where the situation was, it was frozen there. Right. So, but having said that, I think the rebels clearly were honing their skills, were planning, and were building capacities to take up the challenge against President Assad again. And I think with the current situation where Iran is very distracted, considering that Iran was a critical country that propped up the Assad regime for a long period of time. Iran has already suffered a lot of economic turmoil. It has suffered a lot of political turmoil. It has given out a lot of capacities to the likes of Houthis in Yemen, to Hezbollah, where they have lost leadership. Hassan Nasrallah was killed by Israel some time ago. And Ismail Haniyeh of Hamas was killed in Tehran. So there's a lot of domestic turmoil in Iran that they have to take care of, where Syria, I think, became a sort of, we will see if something happens, we will see what we will do. Now that something has happened, I think Iran, along with Russia, which is the second country which supported Assad, and Russia is bogged down in Ukraine, they decided that their capacities are far too stretched at this point of time to try and save Assad in any shape or form.
So Mr. Jolani found a free
He
way.
found a very nice time to get mobilizing, to get his troops mobilizing. And if you see the kind of mobility that has taken place, he's not really fought anyone. From moving in his stronghold in Idlib, which is in northeastern Syria, moving towards Damascus, taking over cities like Homs, Aleppo, Dara. The Syrian army, which is under President Assad, didn't fight. They were not there in some of the cases when Mr. Jolani and his group Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham entered cities. The army personnel basically changed into civilian clothing, and they said, look, we are not part of this war. We don't fight anymore. We have seen that President Assad is politically too weak for us to do anything about it. And they just walked in and took over.
So what does this mean, being politically weak, when there is no democracy? What does political weakness mean?
So here the political weakness means there was a perception that he is under control, that everything is hunky-dory, and that his power is significantly is not constrained, that he is able to mobilize if required to mobilize against these kind of groups.
So this weakness or perception of weakness, it would be limited to about 100,000 or 250,000 army people.
Give and take, right? But the fact that even 100,000 is not a small number for any army, and the fact that they capitulated, they never showed up to the war, showed that the command and control structure of the Assad regime was actually not in place. It's also a possibility that before this kind of mobilization happened, and before President Assad, who's reportedly left Syria now, left the country, that his generals, his majors in the armed forces, people he surrounded himself with, left the country much before that. And it's also possible that they gave him a very false sense of security, that they said, look, actually, it's okay. Everything is fine.
10 years of consistent, and this brings me to the first set of questions, which is around Syria and Syrians.
Yeah.
10 years of consistent control, and overnight you're out?
But we have to see it from the perspective that 10 years of consistent control, but contested control. But prior to that, 30 years of no contestation control. So the expectation was that, yes, there will be loyalists around Assad who have worked with him for 30 years that will protect him under any cost. Because if you don't protect your chosen autocrat, and if an alternative power structure comes into a city or a country, they will be prosecuted. So there is always a fear of retribution from the other side if they are caught. But I think over the past couple of weeks or months at least, a lot of the loyalists that were around Assad read the room.
Could it also be that they had defeated, allegedly, within the area, the ISIS, and therefore felt that all threats were behind them?
Having studied ISIS for a long period of time, I don't understand the concept of ISIS being defeated, to be honest, right? President Trump announced that ISIS has been defeated in 2019. Yes, the ideologue of the Islamic State, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, was killed in Syria. And subsequent replacements that came in were also killed. But the Islamic State's presence in the country has always been there. If you see some of the data from the past 1 year itself, the attacks have amounted in dozens. So if it's not the same thing what we witnessed in 2014-15, but the Islamic State as an entity and an idea and an ideology never really completely went away. So if you see the American presence in Syria, for example, was largely based on countering the Islamic State. They didn't say that we are going to counter Assad or we are going to take on the HTS. They said we are here to take on the Islamic State and nothing else. That automatically means that if there is troop deployment by a foreign power in in Syria, that means the Islamic State is still there. It's just that, if you remember in 2014-15, Islamic State was a shock and awe movement. There were videos of decapitations. There were videos of people being burnt alive, including one Jordanian pilot who they caught. The propaganda was next level. All that has come down, but that does not mean that the movement by itself, the group by itself has disappeared. So that the Islamic State is now, if as of today, has much more space to actually operate in than earlier. No, earlier, what has happened in 2014-15, all these groups, Hay'at Tahrir, al-Sham, the Syrian Democratic Forces, the Syrian army, the Russians, the Iranians, let aside their personal differences and their personal rivalries and said, look, all said and done, first we need to defeat the Islamic State. Then we can come back to what these issues are, right? So everyone had their powers concentrated to the point where the Russians, the Americans were allies, the Iranians were allies. They all were fighting the Islamic State. When the Islamic State was finally, not defeated, but depleted significantly in 2018, 2019, the other parts, the other leftovers of rivalries, of intra-group rivalries, intra-state rivalries, they came out in the open and are playing out even today as we see it.
So now that Mr. Jolani is in charge, what can we expect from him? He's certainly not a moderate. And he works with Al-Qaeda and are closely not linked. I don't know which word to use in this geography, but they work together. I think is the closest, possibly the most accurate depiction. And he says that, so I don't understand him. Is he an Islamist or is he a moderate? And what can Syria expect?
So he's an Islamist, right? If you see Abu Muhammad al-Jolani's history, his real name is Ahmad al-Sharra. So the Abu Muhammad Jolani is a name that he chose and he took to basically represent himself and his brand. His real name is Ahmad al-Sharra. And why I'm saying this is because now that he's entered Damascus, he started using his original name. So when some of the decrees that are coming out, some of the messaging that is coming out is using his original name rather than Jolani, because Jolani was a militant. Al-Sharra may become the politician.
So there's a rebranding happening.
There's absolutely rebranding. These, you have to understand a lot of these groups, a lot of these entities are very, very good in playing the field, so to speak. They know how to become more palatable to certain entities. They know how to become more mainstreamed at some level. They know what PR is. They know what media is. They know the power of media. They know the power of imagery. So, for example, if you see Jolani's pictures from 2018, 2019, 2020, right? He's wearing the turban. He's got the big beard. He's wearing fatigues. His look is very imposing. That of a militant fighting a state, right? Fast forward to 2021, Mr. Jolani gives an interview to an American network called PBS. Right, it was about a 1-hour interview, and he came in a suit and tie. Why? Because he was already started and planning to what we are seeing today, as far back as 2021. He knew what he wanted. I think he read the ground as well, probably much better than everyone else. He saw this weakening of the Assad government taking place, so he started moving. If you're giving an interview to an American channel wearing very civilian clothes, so to speak, that means you are already moving towards a level of acceptance or trying to get accepted. And I think Jolani has been trying to get accepted by the US for a period of time now. If you see where all the including Baghdadi and his successors, where did they all die in Syria? Very close to HTS territories. Right? So that means there is a possibility also that HTS basically said to the Americans, look, we will deliver these to you. If you are here fighting Islamic State, I will deliver these to you for something in exchange. Now, what that exchange is, I'm not particularly sure, and this is also some time ago. So, he comes off as a fairly smart person. And I'll tell you just very quickly, sort of segueing to a bit of a history of Mr. Jolani himself. Yes, he was... post the Iraq war in 2003, that's where he started joining these kind of groups. He does not come from a very poor or debilitated family. He comes from a family from Saudi Arabia, and his father was an oil engineer. So he's not coming from abject poverty. He's not coming from a broken society, so to speak. But he saw what happened in 2003 with the invasion of Iraq. He was radicalized using that war, and he moved to basically join a slew of smaller militant groups at that time. He was imprisoned in something called Camp Bucca, which was run at that point of time, a very notorious prison of all these militants, and there he met Baghdadi. And he bought into the Baghdadi story. He bought into the Islamic State story. So Baghdadi, became sort of Baghdadi's protege. Right, so he started working with them, and eventually they were let go from the prison. And Jolani went to Syria carrying some funds from Baghdadi to set up a group in Syria, which was later called the Al-Nusra Front. So he was in Kato with Baghdadi himself. The division started coming when Baghdadi tried to merge his Nusra Front with the Islamic State of Iraq to form the Islamic State as we know it today. Because Jolani was much more of a pragmatist. He wanted to gain the support and he wanted to gain the admiration of the local Syrian people. And if you are Islamic State at that time, chopping heads, destroying people, burning houses, that's not how you gain public sympathy. So Jolani distanced himself from the Islamic State, and the most secure way to distance himself was to join Al-Qaeda, which is the alternative, which is the other way around. So he joined Al-Qaeda, and that also did not stick beyond a point. So I think his association with Al-Qaeda had a very public falling out. There were a lot of messages released from both sides of why this is not working. Very similar to Abu Musa Zarqawi, who was the ideologue of the Islamic State even before Baghdadi, where the ideological underpinnings of Al-Qaeda did not match what their requirements were. So Jolani, jumped ship from Al-Qaeda as well, and that's where in 2017 Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham came into play.
Such a loaded paragraph you've given us, but now, what is the difference between what was the ideological problem between Al-Qaeda and Jolani?
So
for instance, give one or two.
Yeah, I mean, so like for example, with Islamic State and Jolani was that even for Jolani, Islamic State was too brutal. Why? Because Jolani was more about, okay, fine, I think Jolani at some level preferred to be a bit like al-Shabaab in Somalia. What al-Shabaab did in Somalia was take on territories and installed good governance. So they basically tried to provide people that the state was not providing people. And that automatically, it's a very base thing.
But Al-Qaeda is as vicious and as...
It is as vicious as Islamic State, but not publicly. It does not go into entire villages and burn them down in front of a camera. That Al-Qaeda is very careful about. Al-Qaeda is very, very sort of pointed towards taking on the Americans and the Israelis in the Middle East, for example. Right? They train for that. So if you see, most of their big operations are largely against the Americans and the Israelis, or what they call the occupying forces. On the local front, Al-Qaeda doesn't have any propaganda material where they are going and just shooting down villages. But Islamic State does. So if you are someone like Jolani, who is a slight pragmatist within the confines of being a militant, and he said, look, how am I going to gain the trust of the local people where I'm trying to set up my base if you guys keep on releasing these videos and pictures of outright and abject destruction of the same community? So that those were his divisions, and which it is a very important division because when Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham came into play in 2017, up until 2021, 2022, they had actually installed a fairly well laid out governance structure in governance like Idlib. Right, so they had hospitals under HTS, they had an ambulance service under HTS, they had water supply under HTS, they had electricity supply under HTS, all that. So they were almost a quasi-state within the state of
So
the
this
Syrian
branding
regime.
or rebranding that you are talking about, is it a step towards governance, or is one autocrat going to replace another autocrat?
So look, I mean, we have to see if even if that is a rebranding from Jolani, for whom is that rebranding? If it's for the locals in Syria, if it's for a certain section of society in Syria, it seems to have worked for him in Idlib. Now, that's not to say that his acceptance in certain parts of Syria is only based because he installed some level of governance. It's a mixture of governance and outright fear that he utilizes. Right? So if you go against him, he's like in any other militant. You go against him in those parts of the Syrian governorates, you're done.
So the benign dictator, or
He's a benign theocrat. He's a benign theocrat, who, if comes into power in Damascus, will replace an autocrat with a theocrat. So that's the
So how
play.
will it impact the Syrian lives?
So see, right now, it's very, very interesting because if you see the normal Syrian response at this point of time, it is that of euphoria, not because Jolani has come in. We haven't seen really much support for him per se. The euphoria is that the Assads are gone. So they are in that after about Assad's 5-decade-long run, Hafiz Assad before him, his father, and then Bashar after him, which was 30 years. The allegations of human rights violations, oppression are so many and are so deep. I think majority of the Syrian population is just happy that he's gone. And this comes to a very delicate balance of sectarianism and ethnicities within Syria also. For a long period of time, it's not new. The Assad family comes from what they call is an Alawite background. Right, so Alawites are Shias or follow a branch of Shia Islam, and they are only about 10% of Syria's population.
Is Sunni there.
Majority is Sunni Arab. So when the rebels started in 2011, 2012, Arab monarchies like the UAE and Saudi Arabia were forced to support the rebels, and the rebels were fighting for democracy, and Arab monarchies are not democracy. So from a political design point of view, the Arab monarchies were forced to support something that they actually don't particularly support themselves. But they had to support because they were Arab Sunnis. So they could not be seen as countries that are backing Bashar al-Assad. Right? And even if that meant that Assad could, let's say, on paper, maintain a semblance of security, geographic security at least, if nothing else, right? But they were in this cross of having to support the population because they were Arab Sunnis, and about 75% of the population in Syria is Arab Sunni. So countries like UAE and Saudi in the beginning of the movement in 2011, 2012, 2013 did support them, had to support them. There was no option.
So Mr. Jolani is a Sunni.
Yeah.
So can this be in some way seen to be a democratic authoritarian surge?
I don't.
It's not democracy the way we see it.
No. So I mean, coming back to the point that we can't see HTS as being the core stakeholder of the movements. Starting from 2011, HTS came in 2017. When it started, the movements were much more organic. Arab Spring did not happen only in Syria. It started from Tunisia and then it came down through Egypt, Syria, and so on and so forth. There are not many success stories out of the Arab Spring. If you see Egypt also, if you see Syria also, and even Tunisia till a certain extent. But, it's as far as the supports were concerned in 2011, 2012, the movement was towards the democratic process. So even back then, Barack Obama, who was a US president, did support the Arab Spring. He said these are the movements of change. Why? Because the American system, for a long period of time, for decades, it's changing now, but for decades, promotion of democracy was a core tenet. In the Middle East, it's not there anymore.
Now America has to worry about its own democracy, by the way.
Well, that is also there.
Yeah.
That is also there, which we have seen multiple times,
yes.
right? But I think they have taken a slight step back from that core component of their foreign policy, which was not necessarily just for the Middle East. Promotion of democracy was a broader construct that they have. They still have that. But in the Middle East, I think they have decided to take a step back on that particular tenet. So in the starting, when a lot of these groups mobilized, 2011, 2012, 2013, largely the call was for a democratic process, right? And it changed, it evolved over time. The Syrians pushed back using help from the Russians and the Iranians. The Iranians also called in Hezbollah when Assad was very weak. So very, very timidly, Hezbollah also sent fighters, because if Hezbollah was sending fighters into Syria, then they are actually letting go of capacity in Lebanon. So they were very, very, Hassan Nasrallah was very not happy about sending troops into Syria, because he needed those troops in Lebanon. But anyway, he did, because Iranian pressure came into play. So, so to prop up the Assad regime, the Iranians built up proxies. They said, okay, your army may not fight directly because they are weak or they are fractured. The proxies will. Why? Because it is very important for us. Syria became a very conduit region for the Iranians to rearm Hezbollah, for example, or to make sure that, Assad stays, and a pro-US or pro-West or a pro-Arab
so we'll come to this part shortly.
Yeah.
Now, let's stay within Syria for now. So let's forget democracy, let's forget good governance. Will the civil war end?
I don't. So I see it actually expanding rather than ending. I think the euphoria right now of Assad being removed is largely just the Syrian general public of all ethnicities. Assad was by most accounts, an equal opportunity offender. Right? It did not matter beyond a point the ethnicity and the sectarianism. If you challenged Assad in some shape or form, then consequences were to be had. So I think just the removal of that blanket of fear is what the Syrians are celebrating right now. We are not discussing the day after. Right? There
is no new fear anticipated.
I mean, not as of now. Right. So very, very interestingly, that is where someone like Jolani's messaging is very interesting. Right. He's saying that, look, we have no issues with the minorities. Right. In Latakia, for example, the minorities held a meeting on how best to preserve the way of life that they have lived for such a long time, which is not of fighting with each other. And he's released those statements. He said, look, I have no problems as of now with the Christians, for example. I have no problems with the Alawites. The big core concern, even right now, is that there could be a massacre against the Alawites, because they have been seen for 5 decades as the oppressors. So all that, it's too early right now. Right? The HTS walked into Damascus 48 hours ago. So everyone, the euphoria that we see right now, especially from, let's say, the Arab diasporas living abroad, is because a lot of those diasporas were pushed out of these countries. So they lost homes, they lost families. They're finally seeing that oppression going away. What comes after that? Is it going to be another branch of oppression? Is it going to be something that is someone like Jolani, who has anchorings in Islamic State and Al-Qaeda and all these militant groups? Or is it going to be something else, maybe from the Syrian Democratic Forces, which are backed by the Americans, who could, let's say, if they heed to the call of a democratic process, may get more support from the West, because that is more palatable to them. All that is up in the air right now. No one is discussing it right now. In Syria, people are just happy the Assad is gone. But what happens after that? Who is Jolani? How is he going to behave?
And what's he going to do?
What is he going to do?
No
one knows.
So
absolutely no one knows.
Those are redundant questions.
Absolutely, yeah.
So does this victory inspire other terrorists, other extremist extremist groups in the region to take over, take charge, bring regime change? gather a country.
This victory is an inspiration by itself. HTS is inspired by what happened in Afghanistan in 2021. When the Taliban walked into Kabul, if you remember, they faced no opposition.
Yeah.
The blueprints are eerily similar. And even then, the military and the government of Ashraf Ghani disappeared. The military and the government of Assad also disappeared, right? And that's a different sort of issue of how hollow were these states really over the past many years. But when the Taliban walked into Kabul, the HTS held regions in Syria, Idlib and other governorates, aired support for the Taliban through mosques. So they celebrated what the Taliban has done, that they've kicked the Americans out after 20 years, they've defeated the Americans.
And Taliban in turn today, just a few hours ago, there was a statement of them.
They congratulated the HTS.
Yes, right.
They congratulated the HTS to
So maybe they are sort of united.
They're not united directly.
Ideologically.
Right? They are ideologically united by the fact that they have pushed out their oppressors or their definition of oppressors or who they saw as oppressors. And, but the Taliban statement was very interesting because the Taliban, for HTS, the Taliban is a blueprint. If you are going to run a state, how are you going to run a state? And the Taliban, if you see the statement that they released yesterday, it's not a big statement, but the end part are very small and short guidelines on how to go about it. They say don't fall into the trap of retributions. That means there should not be an Alawite massacre. If that happens, any chance of you becoming a politicized or political entity,
gaining legitimacy
is out.
It's out.
Right? They say protect public institutions, which HTS has done, by the way. So a lot of the cities they took over last week, HTS's own traffic police moved in. HTS's own police moved in. They started managing the city so that there is no fallout, there is no chaos. Right? And most of the people who live in those cities are fine with it. Why? Because...
So within the authoritarian or autocratic surges, there seems to be some effort at delivering governance to get legitimacy. And otherwise, this anger will simply get transferred
absolutely,
onto the...
which is something, for example, the Islamic State never does. If you remember, Islamic State had a territory as big as the geographic area of United Kingdom at a point. That included territories in Iraq, going into Syria, right? But they never got popular support by anyone. Why? Because they're outrightly brutalistic in their tactics. There was no governance. There was outright fear and murder.
So this also means that Jolani and the second or third level lieutenants that he may be having need to work they have to be in tune with one another.
And they have
because
to be.
The final governance happens down the road.
Down the road, yeah. But they have been working on that project within the governorates that they have held since 2018. So if you see some of the works, there are some excellent scholars like Aaron Zellin and Charles Lister who've been looking at Syria for a long period of time. If you see their works, their works identify the governance parts of things, right? So they have been honing those skills for a long period of time now. So if you see some of the ways HTS has sort of installed itself in Idlib, for example, they have their own branding, they have their own flags, they have their own police stations. Crime rate is low, apparently. Public delivery of goods is there. They have their own media. They have been running that separately for a long time now, successfully. They are going to, so they have honed those skills for their own people also. And that has helped someone like Jolani because, for example, over the past 3-4 years, he's also opened a military academy. He's also opened a technology school sort of thing to build autonomous weapons and hybrid weapons and so on and so forth. He was also joined a long time ago by a lot of Assad loyalists from the military. So he's using their skill sets on how to build a professional armed forces. Right.
So there is a governance direction in what we can see. And maybe Syria will turn out to be, let's say 12 months later, Syria may be in a better place than it is today.
I'm not going to I'm not going to say if it's going to be in a better place or not.
Speculate.
Okay, I'll speculate, and I don't see it being in a better place.
Despite all these?
Despite all these things, because replacement of violence with potential violence is not a model. Ideally, when these kind of changes take place, there needs to be a very strong opposition ecosystem led by strong opposition leaders that can fill political vacuums very quickly. Strong opposition leaders that appeal to the entire gambit of representation in a state. That's not the Jolani is not that person. His appeal is that he's removed Assad. Right, that he was a core challenge to Assad.
So it actually is, the story begins today or on Sunday.
The story began on Sunday. So which is something that has been concerning me since Sunday, because as I said before, the euphoria is understandable, but how do you bring the state in a place of management now? Like, who is going to do that? Right now, the problem is that it seems like Jolani is the only person who's going to do that. The Prime Minister of Syria, al-Jalili, I think he was under Assad only, made a call yesterday saying that there should be free and fair elections. Now, Jolani is not the person who's going to do elections. So we are, at this point of time, if Jolani is the reality, we are staring at an outright takeover of a state by a militant organization. He can keep on going and saying, we have moderated, we are open to talks with everyone.
Change his name, he can change his branding.
Al-Sharra will be used more than al-Jolani. He will try to mainstream himself politically, which he's already been trying to do. He's trying to say that he's almost sort of secularist in nature, that he has no problem with minorities, while also simultaneously saying that I will install an Islamic government based on Sharia laws. That, in my head, is...
Just for clarification, do the minorities they are not in tune with Sharia?
I mean, not all of them, because minorities include Christians.
But Shias? Shias are okay with
it. No, I mean, look...
Christians are statistically insignificant.
But they are statistically insignificant, but will the Alevites agree to a decree of Sharia as installed by a, let's say, a Sunni Islamist movement? I doubt it. Right? That is something at core, for example, that Iran pushes against globally. It builds up entities and builds up capacities to push against Salafism, for example, as an ideological sort of differentiation between what they believe in, right? So it's too early to say. For a long period of time, for example, Israel was okay with Assad, right? Why? Because Israel at some level thought, you know what, a devil that you know is better than a devil that you don't know. So right now there is Jolani is the second half. So yes, people are happy that Assad is gone, as you see from multiple statements.
The new entity is unpredictable.
It's very unpredictable. You don't know which way it's going to go. And if tomorrow there is a direct challenge to Jolani, all this moderation and everything, we may start seeing HTS 2.0 arguments, like we saw the Taliban 2.0 arguments coming in, that we can deal with him, it's fine. But no one has put their eggs in that basket yet. So even the US statement says we will deal with all Syrian groups. Now they haven't specified which Syrian groups. Does that mean HTS? Because Jolani has a $10 million bounty on his head. But then, so does Sirajuddin Haqqani. And the Americans meet him. Not just meet him, they signed a deal with the Taliban. So we are in this very weird space where the war on terror is finished. The Americans are very, they're tired from this entire thing. They don't want to get into it beyond the point. They will secure their security. But this normalization of militant groups taking over states, Afghanistan being one, potentially Syria being the other, parts of Somalia under al-Shabaab, will embolden faraway places like West Africa, where groups like Al-Qaeda and Islamic State are actually very powerful.
Thanks. I'll now come to the second set of questions. This was
Sure.
internal. Now let's go start looking outside. How will Jolani impact the other countries? So let's start with the most important, Iran. Iran has been a supporter of the previous regime. Actually, it's been supporting itself because I think it needs a handshake to Lebanon, and perhaps that regime provided it. So how does this change, if at all, anything between for Iran?
Iran is in a very difficult spot. For a long period of time, they, along with Russia, were solely responsible for keeping Assad stable. Right? I think if Iran and Russia did not do that, Assad would have actually gone a long time ago. But it was also interesting to see that when Assad was falling over the past couple of hours or past couple of days, the Iranians didn't move. They did not, beyond just platitudes, that we support you and we will rearm the Syrians and so on and so forth. They did not mobilize capacities beyond a point. And that raises a lot of questions as to why. Because, did they not want to be seen as spending a lot of their already stretched capacities, military capacities, to be deployed again in Syria? Or they just realize that it's already a lost battle in Syria. There's something, as an external actor, they cannot do. Now, from a Jolani's point of view, he's made hints already that he's not happy with having foreign powers in Syria. That automatically means the Iranians and the Russians.
And US.
And the US, of course. Yeah. And the US, of course. Interestingly, the US has hinted that their forces who are there only to fight the Islamic State are not going anywhere. But this relies on an eventual reality, if it happens, of Jolani being able to successfully enforce his rule throughout the country. Right now, he's come from a certain part of Syria into Damascus. A lot of the other parts are not touched yet. There are other parts where the SDF is more prominent. There are parts where Islamic State is still there. Who's going to take on that? Who's going to do the cleanup? Is still a question.
Iran is also under pressure from Israel side.
Iran is already, as I said, stretched thin.
Yeah.
They're already trying to arm the Houthis,
the best it
Hamas.
can do is slightly step back and retain some sort of a non-aggressive status quo until it gathers its momentum all over.
I think a lot of people do with looking at Iran, they give it a lot of precedence as being this sort of ideology-run theocratic state. That, it is run by the Ayatollah, then it's seat of Shia Islam and so on and so forth. And that's how Iran moves forward. That's not true. Yes, that all those things are technically and factually true. But Iran is a very pragmatic state. Right? You have to remember that Iran is also a country that has given strategic refuge to certain candidates of Al-Qaeda. And Al-Qaeda is a Sunni organization. Hamas it supports. Hamas is a Sunni organization. A scholar used a very nice term to explain what Iran is. Iran is not a state that is fighting the Shia-Sunni war anymore. Yeah, Iran is a pan-sectarian state. What Iran says about Palestine, for example, or what's happening in Gaza, they say we are on the side of Muslims. So if you are Shia, Sunni, whatever, if there is injustice happening against you, we will stand against. So we will stand with you. That is their pitch. And they can change that pitch tomorrow. Next week, it could be completely something else. They are very, very pragmatic people and pragmatic power. And they are a country that I like to call is what is a survivalist state. Their core idea and the core aim is to preserve the 1979 revolution and the changes that it brought and the power structures it brought, which includes the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and which includes the Ayatollah. So that supremacy of power needs to be preserved. Now, how is that preserved? You cannot do it outrightly by ideology.
What about these things about the fact that Iran is now cornered, or it has lost one more of its support or a geography, so to say, will now be will accelerate the nuclear creation faster. How do you read that?
That's an argument. The clear sort of thing that has happened right now is the entire construct of its axis of resistance, which included Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthis, and a bunch of militias, Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq, and a bunch of others. That has been fairly significantly dented. This design, so to speak.
So the proxies are gone. Now you are out there in the open.
I'll get to that. Proxies are not gone. And I'll contest that assertion, which we read very generally, that it's been sort of dismantled and so on and so forth. I don't think it's been dismantled. It depleted again, yes. But I also think that this design of proxies, which was created by Qasem Soleimani, who was a well-known general of the Quds Force under the IRGC umbrella, was assassinated in Baghdad in 2020 by the Americans. When you are dealing with proxies, when you are dealing with militia groups and you're trying to make them into a bouquet that listens to you, that always has a shelf life to it. Militias beyond a point really like patronage of money and weapons and power. But they always have their own political agendas that beyond a point you cannot either penetrate and you cannot control. So in my head, this entire axis of resistance design would have had a shelf life for the Iranians also. They're like, this will be utilitarian till this point of time. They built up the Houthis from nothing. Houthis used to be that group that used to share one Kalashnikov amongst 4 fighters. Now they have uniforms, now they have autonomous weapons, everything. It benefits the Houthis, whose politics is based in Yemen. They want power in Yemen. Yes, they attack the Israelis as an ideological conduit, but they are not one of those that want to go and establish a khilafat in Syria also, in Iraq also, and so on and so forth. They are very anchored into the Yemeni cause, or their cause in Yemen. So managing all this beyond a point, I think the Iranians would have known, look, at some point, it has a shelf life to it. But by that time, it will be very useful. So I think we are reaching that stage where the Iranians have realized we will continue to support them, but that unity that everyone has said that this is the axis of resistance may not be there anymore. But that does not mean that these groups have zero use for us now. They will still be one of those groups that will be an outright nuisance to the likes of Israel, to the likes of the Saudis, and to others. And that nuisance is very important to a state like Iran, which wants to have equity of power balance in the region. And if you see Iran's diplomacy over the past 3 months, it's been fairly successful. I mean, whether people like to hear that or not is a different story. But they normalized with Saudi Arabia. They went back into the OIC. They opened an office again in Riyadh for OIC, in Jeddah, for OIC. And when the Iranian foreign minister went to meet his Saudi counterpart a month and a half ago, by protocol, he has to meet the Saudi foreign minister, but MBS came and met him. That shows the importance of that normalization for Saudi Arabia. What did Saudi Arabia want? They wanted some level of protection for their own geographic borders. Since they normalized, the Houthis have not targeted the Saudis. So with normalization, Saudis have bought some level of...
Okay, so this is getting very complicated. Now, Iran...
It is complicated. It's a complicated region.
I know. That's why we have you here, because my mind goes in circles. So Iran and Saudis have shaken hands.
Yeah.
But Iran and Israel, which I'll come to next, haven't.
No.
Saudi and Israel were at the point of shaking hands with that corridor.
Arguably.
Well,
arguably.
Statementally.
Yeah. Arguably.
Statementally. They both made statements and they have signed up, and so signatorily.
Okay.
Now, so how does this work? I'm not talking about standing by what you said, but these conflicting orbits of intersections, and these, if you examine it as a Venn diagram.
Yeah. You cannot make Venn diagrams in the Middle East. That concept does not exist. You can only make hitch-pitch lines everywhere. It's like a scribble.
And it changes.
And someone scribbles every day.
So as of Monday...
It could be something else.
This is what it is.
As of the Middle East, the Syrian crisis, as of right now, is what it is today. right? Things may change tomorrow. For example,
See, IMEC, which goes from Iran, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and then I think Netherlands,
Jordan also. Yeah.
Then clearly Israel is a party to this.
It is.
So how does Iran shaking hands with Saudi but not with Israel work?
But IMEC has nothing to do with Iran. Iran is not a stakeholder in it. IMEC is something that is connecting ports in India to the Middle East to Europe. And in that design, in the Middle East, the involvement is till a certain level, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Israel in Haifa, and parts of Jordan possibly. And then that straight away sort of aligns with Europe. Especially the Mediterranean ports and so on. So Iran is not part of it. With Iran, for example, they have their own connectivity projects. North-South transportation corridor is there. For them, connecting Central Asia is more important than connecting this side. Right. So IMEC is something that the Iranians...
You don't see Chabahar joining this at some point?
No. Chabahar has its own utility, especially for India.
It's a standalone.
It's a standalone thing. Its utility is to connect landlocked countries in Central Asia to a port this side. Its utility is to connect Afghanistan to a port this side. Maybe help even allow Afghanistan to wean off its dependence on the Karachi port in Pakistan. The most Afghan trade is done through Afghan trade is done through Karachi. So if you can get, let's say for state of discussion, you can get the Taliban to use Chabahar instead. That works for everyone. So that's a different game, right? The Chabahar part is a different game to this. IMEC is a completely different game.
So this is one relationship and IMEC is a second relation, and the two shall not meet.
They will not meet. No, they will not meet.
Okay, Israel. So how does this change in Syria impact Israel? I think yesterday they bombed a couple of places in Syria.
Yeah.
What's happening and how will this play out? Israel is in the western part of Syria. Small border it shares.
Yeah.
How does it impact Israel?
Israel has been bombing Syria for a long time. It's not new. But the interesting part is, even as Jolani was entering Damascus, Israel was still bombing Damascus itself. But Jolani has not said anything till now.
Yeah.
Right? He's not made any statements on that. The other part of what Israel always targeted in Syria was around Aleppo. Right? So in that part of the country, a lot of the airports like Aleppo had become these sort of staging grounds for weapon transfers between Iran and Lebanon, between Hezbollah and Iran, basically. So Israel's target was always that you need to get rid of these transportation corridors by themselves, which have come up to aid Hezbollah. Now, coming back to the point I made earlier, Israel had familiarity with Assad, and I'm sure they had very good intelligence penetration.
Known
devil argument. With Jolani, they don't know. The interesting part with Jolani is, if I read somewhere that he's alluded to the fact that if he has to talk to Israel, he's open to talking to Israel also. Right? So now that if in Israel could be seen as something that they can probe, or they'll be like, this guy is from the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda background. We can't trust him to that level where we will open channels with him. But if he takes center stage in Damascus, like everyone else, Israel's first, I'm presuming, strategic movement would be to protect the Golan Heights, which is disputed between Syria and Israel. From what I understand yesterday, the Syrian part of the border of Golan Heights, the Syrian army left. They abandoned, and the Israelis have moved in to basically claim, I guess. But it's still a disputed territory. It's not. It doesn't belong to the Israeli state.
So if a ceasefire is happening now, it would be on Israel's terms.
That's Israel's argument that the agreements that allowed this sort of status quo thing to play out in Golan Heights don't stand anymore because those agreements were done with the Syrian state. Now that the Syrian state is not there.
Let me take one step back now. The fact that Iran is not in tune with Jolani, and therefore Iran's relationship with Hezbollah, the the geography part of geopolitics, is now bordered,
Yeah.
there's a hurdle there,
Yeah.
works in Israel's favor
For the moment, yes.
for the moment,
Yeah.
right? Now, it's in Israel's interest to therefore take this relationship forward. It is also in new Syria's interest to take that relationship forward, except for the Muslim-Jew problem. Is that
That's broadly true, but beyond the Muslim-Jew problem per se, it's what Jolani would not want, I'm presuming, is for Syria to become what Iraq has become. Iraq is a staging ground for battle and influence between the Americans and Iran. So there are multiple layers of politics of Iraq, right? And Iran tries to pull it from one side, and the Americans try to pull it from the other side. Syria would not want to become that again. Geographically, it is very sort of centrally located that way.
Can't it take a Saudi Arabia type of a stance that we are not interested in?
Then you are basically, then someone like Jolani would have to push back against the Iranians and say that, look, we are not going to abide by your designs of what you have been trying to pull till now with the Assads. We will not do that. Now that is a possibility because ideologically as well they are polar opposites.
Which then works in favor of Israel?
Which technically,
it gives them breathing space.
Which is why no one has really sort of separated out the idea that the Israelis may do an outreach to Jolani. Right? This is all based on the fact if Jolani is the person who's actually going to be in Damascus. Right. So right now, everyone, unfortunately or fortunately, will have to just wait and watch and see what happens over the next weeks and months. Because the structure of power in Damascus till now under the Assads for a long period of time was known. That this is how it is. This is the hierarchy. This is what it is. Right. This is the secret police. This is the army and so on and so forth. All said and done, if we have to talk to someone, this is the person we talk to. Right. All that is not there anymore. So at best, what every state is going to do is try to protect its interest.
And as quickly as
possible, secure borders and hunker down and see what happens in the next coming weeks at least.
If I was Israel, I would quickly shut down all and consolidate the vacuum that is now created because of, I wouldn't call it a rift, but because of let's say a disruption in the Iran supply of weapons and support to Hezbollah, and quickly consolidate my position there now and before Trump takes charge.
Yeah.
Because a new pressure is going to come in January when Trump takes charge. No war, this. I don't know how that will play out. That's also a moving target. But this is a good time for Israel, in my opinion, to go ahead, take what it can, for instance, the Golan Heights, and close the deal and come to a status quo.
If you see from what's happening, at some level they are trying that to at least secure, if nothing else. Because the Syrian part of the deal of the Golan Heights is not there anymore. Neither is the treaty and neither are the people.
And on the Lebanon side, they have already destroyed the leadership of Hezbollah, most of it, a large chunk of it, let us say. So before a new bridge is made, this would be time for Israel.
That is true. But you have to also remember that the Hezbollah-Iran relationship and Hezbollah support that it gains from Iran is not a symptom of 2011. It's not that Iran, when it got space in Syria to transfer these or to build these highways of providing weapons to Hezbollah, that they didn't have any other option otherwise. They've been supporting Hezbollah for a long period of time, fairly successfully. So they have channels. I don't think Iran is, the Iranian design of supporting Hezbollah is based on this geographical aspect of things. It may get more complicated. Beyond this point, this was quite easy at that point of time for a good 10 years or 11 years. But Iran has that sort of broader network of things to make sure that Hezbollah gets what it wants to get. Because unlike Hamas or even Houthis till a certain extent, the survivability of Hezbollah is almost existential to Iran also. Right? Iran requires Hezbollah to survive.
And why is Lebanon?
Because even within a Lebanese point of view, there have been sections when it was not when Hezbollah was not the power in Lebanon leading. There have been other ethnicities that have led Lebanon through other wars, through other conflicts, through other challenges. But as we talk about geographies, right? You would want a militia that you really support to be right on the neck of someone like Israel, which you see as your existential crisis point in the region. Yes, Iran has deep ideological aversions to Saudi Arabia. They have normalized, but fundamental challenges between the Shia-Sunni divide still persist. That has not gone anywhere. Coming back to my point, which I made earlier to you, that Iran is a very pragmatic state. It's ideological, yes, which everyone sees. At the core, when it comes to decision making, it's much more pragmatic than ideological.
So let me hold you there. We are discussing Israel, but we are back to Iran. So, and this is the 5th or 6th time you have said that Iran is a pragmatic state. Arey bhai, just end everything and start exporting your oil. What's your problem?
There are sanctions.
If you are so sanctions will go once you start behaving yourself.
They signed the JCPOA in 2015.
Then
Trump came and tore it apart. So the JCPOA was also very contested.
I know we wrote about that.
Very contested thing, because a lot of people said, look, you are giving Iran a leverage point to sell oil, to get out of sanctions. But that is about it. In exchange of some level of, let's say,
peace.
No, not peace. Transparency on its nuclear program.
I'm saying if you are a pragmatic state, your economy has been flat or coming down, the only asset that you have, resource that you have is oil or arms.
Iran has survived without...
I know.
With an economy in trouble.
And I'm saying that the moment you open that pipeline of their oil for the world, remove sanctions in lieu of security that of Iran becoming a Saudi Arabia, essentially,
which it was,
stepping back, and it's already shaking hands with Saudi Arabia. Then I see only an upside for Iran. If you, I'm basing all these questions on you for the 5th or 17th time, saying that Iran is a pragmatic state.
But that pragmatism is what took them to negotiating the JCPOA. The JCPOA was very, very contested. Why? Because a lot of its detractors correctly said that, look, beyond the leverage that we are giving Iran, that you can open up the taps again of your oil trade in exchange for us getting transparency for your nuclear program. They are not delivering anything on the proxies that they have distributed across the region. That was the biggest concern of the Israelis, for example. And even the Saudis till a certain extent. Like, look, all that is fine, but this entire deal is dependent on a very narrow margin, right? And the Iranians are going to unbalancedly gain from it, right? We will not gain from it. The regional security is not really going to gain from it, but they will give access or certain access or some access to the nuclear program. But in exchange of what? In exchange of them being able to sell oil without sanctions. So the money is going to flow in for Iran to continue to do what they are doing this side. That was the main contestation of what the JCPOA was.
And that is something that Iran is unlikely to step back on.
I don't think so. That is why a lot of people saw JCPOA as a victory for Iran. That the Iranians ultimately, who are clearly very good negotiators, very hard negotiators, said that, look, basically sold this idea that if we don't get this, we get a nuclear bomb. So even today, Iran is considered nuclear threshold state. And they have utilized that threshold part very smartly. Again, coming back to the point, you can disagree with them on what they are doing, but for what they are doing has been giving them dividends. And that has been the critical pushback against a lot of detractors of the JCPOA and similar outreach to Iran.
I think when we use the word them, we are only talking about the power elite. We're not talking about the country. And I think at some point, for instance, the manner in which women are now seeking their own rights in Iran. Or tomorrow there could be economic surges of that we need economic rights, or we need a better standard of living. We need this constant sanctions and fights are not helping us as a people will play out. And before that, as a pragmatic state, I'm just trying to be in Iran's feet. I mean, if I have resources that can increase, that can double my per capita income in 15 years, why will I needlessly?
I mean, look, the Iranian people are some of the most resilient people on this planet, right? They have challenged, especially Iranian women, have challenged the Iranian authoritarianism when it comes to what they can wear or where they can study or where they can go and so on and so forth. The problem is that beyond a point, the Iranian state has just managed to thumb these things down very quickly by using lopsided amount of force. And the international community has not been able to do anything about it. Why? Because what are you going to do about it? Intervene? What is the intervention? You can do sanctions. They're already under sanctions. You can't get more under sanctions.
The only thing now left is a full-on war.
Which no one will do.
Yeah.
See,
and we have seen the impact.
No, but because you have to also remember, Iran is not a small country. It's a very big country. It's all said and done a proud nation, right? It defends itself for whatever it is. So all those challenges that come from within, the Iranians have been managed to thumb it down. To the point where a lot of Iranians you meet now, earlier, they used to be like, yes, we would like to challenge the state in the A form, B form, C form. Now there is a sense of depletion where they are like, we are just looking at ways if we can leave the country, right? So all those moods within Iran have changed because the revolution design of 1979, which runs Iran since that time, is small. It's not big. It's small compared to the rest of the country, but has managed to thumb everything down using the IRGC, using force, and making sure that that definition of state, of the Iranian state, of the revolutionary state remains intact.
Okay, so now let's come back to Israel. So you don't see much of a change in the Israeli stance as of now.
I mean, Israelis also, you have to remember, all said and done, fairly stretched itself. Yeah. Right? It is still fighting in Gaza. It has been fighting for the past more than 1 year. It has been
Gaza, Lebanon and
now Syria. All said and done, Israel is also a small state. It's not massive. Its army is going to be limited.
But it has got big support.
It has got critical support. Without that support, it will be very difficult for Israel to survive this.
Yeah.
And if you see Israel's arguments that why does it need to build the most formidable defense technologies and why does it need to build the best missile systems and so on, they've always said, look at our neighborhood. And right now we can see that playing out.
Yes.
That everything of this kind Israel sees as existential. So now that the Syria thing has happened now, that stretches Israel beyond a point. Now, how do they manage that is something that is going to be of worry.
Otherwise, they have to manage a third front there.
Yeah, exactly. And geographically, Syria is much bigger. Right? Gaza is still, you have fairly controlled sort of thing. And, Lebanon is largely southern Lebanon at this time. And
I think Israel border with Lebanon is larger than... longer than...
No, it is. Border-wise, yes. But the country is not as big, right? So if there is discontent in a country moving towards...
what is there in Syria?
No, there's nothing there.
$9 billion economy. There is nothing.
No, there's nothing there. If tomorrow Syria, under, let's say, any representation, whether it's Jolani or whatever comes, says that our core aim is going to be to disrupt Israel.
And they put all their energies in that.
Then the level of border doesn't matter, no.
True.
What border is mobilized between Syria and Iran? Iran still mobilized Syria towards that. Right?
It doesn't even share a border.
Share a border. So, I think that's a little bit of a old thinking that you need to have that border to have that kind of contestation. I think there are enough
missiles don't need,
which we have seen.
They don't recognize
Iran
borders.
launched missiles towards Israel. Israel responded towards Iran. There are countries in the middle. Iraq, they crossed the entire country of Iraq. And Iraq had to tell them, please don't use our airspace.
Houthis tried to send a missile.
Exactly. And Houthis tried to fire missiles towards Israel, and Israel is almost 2,300 kilometers away. So that old sort of adage of that you need geographical contestation is not there anymore.
Yeah, good point. Let's move to Moscow. Now, again, no border.
Nowhere close.
And yet, so much friendship, so much control, such high stakes. Now, their person is now out. And I don't think there is anything called my person, your person.
Yeah.
There are only my interests and your interests.
Yeah.
So, the person who somehow was or perceived to be safeguarding Russian interests and vice versa is now out. How does Russia play out?
See, I think this is a blow to Russia. Like Russia, for a long period of time, is almost like a aspirational power that wants to project its interest and power beyond its borders, something what the Americans do, very similar to what the Americans do. Now, it does not have the economic might for it. Its economy compared to everything else is fairly small. I think it's smaller than India, if I remember correctly. But
Russia?
I think so. Yeah.
Russia is half of India.
Half India.
It's
So there you go.
2 trillion.
Yeah. So there you go. But, they have always had this ambition that they are a global power. And
Which they are. They have the maximum number of nukes. They have perhaps one of the world's largest resources of various types.
Yeah.
And they are among the top weapons manufacturers.
on paper, all true. All of that has been given a reality check since they started the war in Ukraine. All said and done. Let's not get into the modalities of why that war exists. The war is there, right? But if you see the kind of impact it has had on its defense military complex, which was seen as very deep, as something that is unpenetrable, can manage everything. Otherwise, why would they need autonomous weapons from Iran? What technological know-how does Iran have that they can't make if their resource on defense is so strong? We've always seen them as very strong in defense, as India, specifically considering majority of our...
import so many.
we import so much from them. But the war has impacted their industrial complex to the point where a country like India is still waiting for its S-400s. Defense minister is supposed to be going soon to tell them, look, we need spare parts for our military because good 60-65% of our military is your equipment. So there have been some grave realities check that Russia has got. I'm not even saying that we think that they have got. I think they have realized with the war in Ukraine. So they are very bogged down with it now. Now for Russia, when it comes to Syria, propping up Assad helping to prop up Assad was largely because Syria is the only place in the Middle East where the Russians have a base.
Yeah, how many bases? I wanted to know. They have bases. Do you know how
So
many?
they have 2 bases.
And America has one.
America has a deployment. It's not a base. They're different things. So for example, in 2015, Assad formally invited the Russians to intervene in Syria and under the garb of that, come and fight the Islamic State. The idea was to help Assad consolidate and float. And at that time, Islamic State, as we were discussing, everyone was sort of concentrated on it. So they came. And they set up their military infrastructure there. Over a period of time, they also took responsibility of building up Assad's own military and arming it and training it, which clearly hasn't worked as we saw in the past 1 week. But they have those bases on the coastal parts of Syria, one naval base, one air force base, which were attacked even during 15-16 by the Islamic State and other rebels. Using drones and so on and so forth. But why it is so important for Russia to have those bases is because it is their only real tactical presence in the region and their only real tactical presence in the Mediterranean.
And therefore access to Europe.
And therefore access to Europe from the southern flank. Yeah. Because otherwise they are just boxed in to the north. This is the only place they have now where they can mobilize from. So they have a big naval base there, and there were some unconfirmed reports. I'm pretty sure they were not entirely true, but when Assad left Syria, a lot of these bases were getting close to being abandoned, with the ships still there, with assets still there. But over the past couple of...
like Afghanistan...
Similar. It's very similar.
What happened to US in Afghanistan?
Russia chides the US to what happens in Afghanistan. They are facing the same situation in Syria. There's no difference, right? They can say what they want, but they are facing that kind of quasi-humiliation the way the Americans faced. But, it's still they have not on paper really left the bases yet. So it's not, Bagram hasn't happened. Bagram happened in the US where there are pictures of the last American soldier leaving. I don't think that has come out yet. Now it depends on how desperate is Russia to maintain those bases. Because the only way to maintain those bases would be to cut a deal with al-Jolani. And the Russians are good at that.
So are Americans.
But
Americans will also want to cut a deal with...
but Americans don't have a base. Americans have a base in Qatar and UAE, much safer places, right? They don't have a base in Syria. They have a deployment of about 800 soldiers. That deployment is under the Operation Inherent Resolve umbrella, which is to fight the Islamic State. That's it. Nothing beyond that, right? And even I think, I can't remember, if when Trump comes in January 20, he might say those also come back. There's no point in being there, because if you see his tweet, he said no interventions.
No intervention.
Yeah.
That's right.
So, but Americans have other bases. They have Turkey is a huge base for them. They even have nukes there, right? So, and in UAE, in Qatar, they can utilize Saudi Arabia if required. So on, they have that covered. The Russians don't have any of that sort. This is it. So if this is lost, then
they've lost the geography.
They've lost the geography. That's a good way to put it. Now it comes down to how important does Putin think this is? Because Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, was giving a speech in Doha yesterday. And he was asked repeatedly and badgered on Syria. He wanted to talk Ukraine.
Yeah.
But he was asked about what's happening in Syria. And he said, look, I feel very bad for the Syrian people. I wish them well. So that's not saying anything, but there is no conviction to keep on supporting Syria in the way that they had been previously, because Assad is not there. Assad is in Moscow, as per the Russian state media. So now how do they want to maintain the basis? And how are they going to do that will depend on ultimately what the political reality in Damascus is going to be. Now that opens up a space that, do you want to be that country that gets involved in that reshaping of Damascus? And that is an open question for Russia, for Turkey, for US, for the Arab states, and for Iran. So as much as Jolani says that we want to push out foreign interference, I'm not sure how capable he is going to be to push out that foreign interference. Because everyone will try to shape Syria the way they want to shape it as. Right? If the Arabs hypothetically shape it the way they want to shape it, it's unpalatable to the Iranians.
We are discussing all this as though Syrians have no agency of their own.
The people have limited agency of their own right now. Because, see, what does political agency mean? That representation comes in a formalized structure. Where is the opposition right now? Coming back to my point that most of the Arab Spring revolutions failed because people got so enamored by the concept of a revolution, they didn't understand that ultimately you require very quick movement of politics to fill in vacuums. Because if you don't fill in vacuums, there are very nimble non-state elements that are going to shift in, which happened multiple times. So you can, it's very different to watch these things and get enamored on Instagram or on social media. But if Assad fell down and there was no political structure, opposition structure in Syria that could say, okay, we will move in, we will talk to Jolani also, we will talk to this also, we will talk to that also, let's get everyone together. There was no semblance of that structure available at all, not even close. Jolani had a free reign. He just walked in. Very similar to there was no opposition in Afghanistan. Why? Either they were dismembered or they were dismantled, they were not empowered, or they were abroad. So if you're abroad or dismembered, either way, it's the same thing. Right? So if that opposition was not available, then the next best thing is whatever is powerful. Whatever can thumb power down.
So Russia too is in a back foot. It's not in a good place.
It's not in a good place at all. And I am presuming they will have to rethink about what their strategy in Syria is going to be, because they moved a lot of military assets from Syria to the war in Ukraine because they were short of equipment. So a lot of movement happened that side also. And if you see some of the rebel groups that have taken over equipment which was left behind, they were mostly Russian air defense systems and guns and so on and so forth. So I think the Russians will have to realistically look at, yes, they have interests in Syria. Yes, they have interests in Mediterranean. Is Ukraine more important right now or this side? And they'll have to make a tough choice, I presume.
Beirut. We've already discussed how the supply of weapons and support from Iran is going to there'll be hurdles. And on the south side, Israel has been hammering them. So in the short term, how does this change Lebanon?
Let me just highlight that Lebanon has been in a terrible economic and political situation for a long period of time. Why? Because again, various
I think from the 70s onwards, there has been a downward.
There has been a downward thing. I mean, till the 70s, Beirut was known as the Paris of the East. It doesn't look like the Paris of the East anymore. But you have to remember that all said and done, the Israel-Hezbollah ceasefire has been sticking. We have not seen major infractions playing out. If you see, even if you open up the news, how many times the projectile has gone from this side and that side, it's happened. It's not broken the ceasefire yet. So it's still holding. Why? It works for Israel, right? They have now multiple fronts to manage. If that front can be quiet for some time, they can put some effort here or put some effort there. For the Lebanese and for Hezbollah, they have encountered such loss that you have to remember that, Hezbollah is also a political entity. They fight elections in Lebanon. If you lose public sympathy, empathy, support, tomorrow the challenge against Hezbollah may come from within Lebanon for them. So they have to, it's a double-edged sword for them on how to manage this. This is, of course, also keeping into account their hierarchy is not there anymore.
Leadership is not
there anymore. A lot of their top military strategists
have been killed.
There is a vacuum. 100%.
And so there is a political vacuum, there is a terror vacuum, and there is a military vacuum.
Absolutely.
All three working together.
And but all said and done, there are larger influence groups like the US, Europe, Saudi Arabia that can try and manage events in Lebanon more than anywhere else. History, colonial history, whatever it is, however you may see it. But a country like Syria is in that position right now where none of that will work. Because Jolani is not a rational actor.
He's amorphous right now.
We
don't even know what he's thinking.
No, we don't know what he's thinking. There's good research available about how he came up and how he built up HTS and how they govern it.
But now, as you said, he's now changing his branding. So that is the past.
That is the past, right?
That has brought him here.
That is the past.
He cannot continue on that.
No.
On those laws. He has to change. Which he's already doing.
Absolutely. So the first thing, but that unraveling can be better managed by a country like Israel, for example, if one of the ceasefires is sticking. So it's in Israel's interest right now to at least keep that ceasefire. They are under no illusion that problem is resolved. I don't think it's going to get resolved anytime soon. But if the border can be kept quiet, then they can at least put in some energy into seeing what is happening this side. Most the 3-4 core security meetings in Israel that took place this past weekend were all Syria related, not Gaza or not Lebanon, because that they know what's happening, right? That the problems they know. That's not a big issue. But they're looking at this right now, how to handle this. And as you said, the joker in the deck is going to be Trump. How is Trump going to see this?
Let's move north. Turkey. Turkey is one of the successful economies. I think it was close to being $1 trillion economy. It's a member of G20. And how does Jolani impact Erdogan?
So Erdogan is just very happy to see Assad go. Right? I think that is his base mood right now. But HTS is a designated terror group in Turkey also. And the Turks have supported the rebels. They have supported the SNA, the Syrian Nationalist Army, not the HTS. The SNA is something that the Turks honed and supported. And the Turks are always very worried that, any sort of political vacuum in this part of Syria or Iraq also will give successful rise to Kurdish nationalism. That is their concern. Their concerns are not Jolani. We'll manage Jolani. It's fine. Everything else we'll see. The Kurdish movement should not happen. The Kurdish movement towards autonomy should not happen. That they should not have more geography under their belt. So organizations like the Syrian Democratic Forces, which are supported by the Americans, and the Kurdish within the Syrian Democratic Forces that were frontline fighters against the Islamic State, is not something palatable to Erdogan and Turkey. And Turkey is a NATO ally of the US. So they are at odds. There have been a lot of meetings between Turkey, Russia, Turkey, US to manage this part of Syria for a long period of time now. The Turkish, Russian and I'm forgetting the third one, but 3 foreign ministers met on the sidelines of the Doha Forum again discussing
Saudi.
No, I don't think it was Saudi. It's Turkish, Russian, one more. Anyway, so they met on the Iranian. So Turkish, Russian, Iranian foreign ministers met on the sidelines of Doha Forum to discuss Syria as part of the Astana format. They have been discussing that part of Syria for a long period of time. So there have been these multiple small siloed diplomatic designs to manage Syria's very fractious position, even in the past. So who's supporting what? Right, the Syrian Democratic Forces is something that, for example, even in India were covered very well because they were the front lines against the Islamic State. They still have camps like Al-Hol camp where there are about 10-15,000 pro-Islamic State people in a makeshift entity. So tomorrow if something happens and that camp comes down, you have 15,000 pro-Islamic State people just roaming around. And the only point between that happening and not happening is the Kurds in the middle. A lot of time, a lot of reports said at least 1 or 2 of the post-Baghdadi caliphs of the Islamic State died because of intelligence provided by the Kurds. So they have cultivated their support with the Americans and the West over the past 10, 12 years. The Turks have a different view of things. They don't want the Kurds to be powerful because the Kurdish organizations such as the PKK and so on are also designated terror groups in Turkey. So that's a completely different viewpoint of security and strategy to what, let's say, the Americans would be espousing at that point of time, and also fairly different to what the Iranians would be thinking about. That's why the Russians and the Turks and the Iranians talk separately. Right? So a lot of these, siloed diplomatic initiatives from the past will matter how Syria comes out in the future, whether under Jolani or whoever else. And whoever comes to the helm will have to deal with these realities, will have to manage this. The Taliban does it fairly well. Right? The Taliban fights with Pakistan.
See, when you have a border, you are more willing to negotiate things.
Exactly. Why? Because Turkey is still very worried that they don't want a Syrian refugee crisis in their border. The Europe is worried that Turkey will get a refugee crisis in their border. And what will Turkey do? Probably open gates on both sides and tell them to go to Europe. Last time this happened, it reoriented European politics. That we even see playing out today. The right really got emboldened in Europe due to the Syrian refugee crisis. So Europe doesn't want that anymore. In a lot of places in Europe, it is the right that is in power, so they are certainly not going to want this. So multiple things come into play when it is this or this is happening right now. At that time, earlier, the refugees were weaponized. The refugees were told and pushed towards the Turkish border to put pressure on Turkey and Europe. Right? Now, next time that kind of exodus happens, it could be just a very natural exodus, that people are escaping chaos. So whoever comes into Damascus may well have to talk with all these actors so that these kind of realities of refugee exodus and so on doesn't happen.
Now, the quietest player in this geography is Iraq. But it has the largest border with Syria.
It does.
599 kilometers. Okay, and it is the quietest. Is it irrelevant? Is it no stakes, or is it okay?
It comes off as very nonchalant, doesn't it?
Yeah.
See, Iraq, like I mentioned very briefly in my previous comment, has since 2003 has been a tug of war between the Iranians and the Americans. Right? Even some.
So again, another agency-less country.
Fairly agency-less. Who the leader becomes in Baghdad is always seen as he's either pro-Iran or he's pro-West. If he's pro-West, the pro-Iran section will try to pull him down. If he's pro-Iran, the pro-West section will try to pull him down. That's the history of Iraq since post-2003. So it has very little agency. right? It doesn't really have sort of a big say in anything. So when, for example, missiles fly over its airspace, either from this side or that side, they will release a statement saying you can't use our airspace like this. We are very upset.
But they can't do anything.
But they can't do anything. But they have played conduits prior to this. They were one of the first to mobilize and host talks between the Saudis and the Iranians before the Chinese came. Chinese benefited from a lot of work that the Iraqis and the Omanis did. Chinese were a very good place to put the sign in, but the Iraqis played a significant role in bringing that sort of thing together. So beyond the point, as far as political agencies goes, Iraq is a bystander at best. Fortunately or unfortunately, that's for their politics to decide. But it doesn't have the power to sway opinions or decisions in any way.
Another Iraq equivalent is Jordan. Again, it has a border. It's been largely quiet. You don't hear much. Does it have a stake in this? Does this impact Jordan in any way?
Not particularly. Jordan's bigger problem is still the war in Gaza. There is a significant amount of Palestinian population in Jordan. And they have, obviously, since they are Palestinian, there is a lot of support for what is happening for the Palestinian people in Gaza. And I think they are fairly happy right now just managing that. I don't think whoever comes, whether it's Jolani or whatever it is, I think they'll manage the border areas of their concern. But beyond that, the powers in Amman just want to make sure that what's happening in Palestine does not adversely impact their political structure in the country, because it's always a probability if there is a big section of society of that is looking at a war from a distance and seeing their own kind being affected adversely, and there is nothing that state is doing, the chances of internal upheaval are quite high. So they are just making sure that doesn't happen. Beyond that, I think on issues like Syria and stuff, they'll unless there is something that needs to be taken care of on the border, they will not.
They are neutral, so to say.
I don't think they are neutral. I think they just have bigger fish.
Are they Assad side or are they Jolani side?
No, I mean, I would be very surprised if anyone is on Jolani's side right now. Right, Assad, as I said before, a lot of people are unhappy with him, specifically the way he treated a lot of people. But people were like, okay, I mean, known devil. We know how to deal. We know how to secure our border, our interest, or immediate interest with him. Right now, it's grey areas for everyone.
US, it has a presence, you said. It has 800 people.
About. Yeah.
So you think after Trump comes, they will go?
I mean,
because there are no stakes here.
There are very few stakes here. There are very few stakes here. There are very few interests here.
Would it not want to be there just to prevent Russia? Or
800 soldiers are not going to prevent Russia from doing anything. The core reason why those soldiers are
to keep some sort of a contact with Jolani or whoever.
Again, you don't need soldiers on the ground for that. If a contact is coming for Jolani, it's either going to be done in diplomatic or an intelligence level.
So logic suggests that they may...
Which is what a lot of people, especially on the Republican side, but also on the Democrat side, have said for a long period of time, that these 800 people in Syria have this, we conduct a lot of, the Americans conduct a lot of aerial exercises against Islamic State anyway. So on ground, unless, it's absolutely pivotal to where you are targeting, 800, 900 soldiers make very little sense, because they become sitting targets also. So if there are proxies roaming around in a place like Syria, there are proxies roaming around in Iraq, they do target these bases, right? In Iraq, multiple times they've been targeted by Kataib Hezbollah, for example. So the fear is always that there are going to be fatalities. And that fatalities are not going to be good for American domestic politics. That is the core concern. And I think beyond the point, there have been enough voices on Democratic and Republican sides saying that we are not really understanding this deployment. Is it really critical? We can have presence using air power, superior air power, but these people on the ground, what are they representing and why they are there? It's slightly bewildering to a lot of people, I presume.
I was thinking that perhaps Europe will face another refugee crisis following what has happened in Syria now. You are suggesting that Syrians are actually celebrating the exit of Assad. So Europe need not be worried on this count.
I mean, look, more than Europe.
In fact, could there be a reverse? Could
there's
people
not definitely not going to be a reverse. There's definitely not going to be a reverse in a permanent sense. But for Europe, for example, Turkey, I think, had almost 3 to 3.2 million refugees on its side of the border. So if all that doesn't happen again, that's good for Turkey and that's good for Europe as well. Which means if you see some of the statements already being released in Europe and stuff, they have this sort of, we will work with the Syrians for their betterment and all. Now, no one has defined who are these Syrians. They are just saying that we will work with the Syrians for the betterment of their future and our future. Now, no one has gotten into the intricacies of, there is no power structure in Damascus right now. So when you are saying that we will work with the Syrians, who do you want? Like the American statement said, we will work with all Syrian groups. Does that mean Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham? So is America ready to talk with a group that has been affiliated with both Islamic State and Al-Qaeda? Is that going to happen? There's no clarity. The statements are vague. The statements are basically to reassure the populations that we are not abandoning the cause of Syria as a state. So whenever the time comes, who do we have to talk to, we will decide. But we are just letting you know that.
So in the short term, no refugee crisis for
I would be surprised. I mean, the refugee crisis happened on two formats. That the fact that Syrian and Russian air power really decimated a lot of the that part of Syria. People became homeless. People just rushed to save their lives, basically. Islamic State was a thing. Islamic State went brutally from town to town killing people. So a lot of people moved that side again. So there were not just one reason of why people left. The larger reason was the civil war, right? Now, if there can be a political entity that can come and say, look, at least that part has stopped. So it's good for Turkey, for example. They'll say, we have 3 million refugees, now they can go back. Or at least a chunk of them go, some of them can go back, right? So it's again, not crystal ball gazing. It's a difficult and dangerous thing to get into, but it's very wise for everyone who's being very euphoric at this point of time, whether regionally, domestically, or internationally, to wait and see what the new power is going to be. Because without that, you can't predict on how to deal with the country, how to deal with the civil war, how to deal with the reconstruction, or how the regional countries will respond to that power structure. That is very, very important. Not everyone is going to be on the side of whatever power structure is going to come. And how is that ultimately managed? On a broader scale, from counterterrorism perspective, for example, if al-Jolani is the person that takes stake, where does that leave global counterterrorism? How are we going to, if this is the second state that falls under a militant group that has served with some of the most brutalist Islamist organizations.
And there's fear of a more domino effect happening.
Definitely, and you have to remember that a lot of other places that no one talks about, such as the African Sahel, where a lot of these groups have gained a lot of ground, are very fragile states. No one is going to go there and try and stop them. The Russians tried and they have been struggling for a long time now. Right? And the Russians only did it because they wanted the West to leave. And the French left. French were the last forces, I think, that were there. So if that domino effect goes to more fragile states on different continents, then you have really lost the plot of global security at some level. And who's going to bring it back? Because everyone says, well, the Americans are not keen on it anymore. They don't want to be the world's policeman anymore. Neither does the world want them to be the policeman. So who's next? What's the plan? Who's going to have that capacity and intent to try and build something in the vacuum that, let's say, the Americans leave behind? We have not had that conversations, right? We are very happy the Americans are leaving. Well, some people are happy the Americans are leaving. But what happens when that capacity is not there anymore? No one has thought about that yet. People will think about it when things start going south, because that is human nature.
Okay, so the last question in this series of questions is India. We are 3 or 4 countries. I mean, if you include Afghanistan, we are 4 countries away. If you don't, just border to border,
We have to.
We are 3 countries away from Syria. And I saw the MEA statement this morning, and after the usual, we expect Syrian people, etc., etc., there was this line which said, our embassy in Damascus is in contact with the Indian community for their safety and security. What are Indians doing in Syria?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure what they're doing in Syria, but I after this statement came, I checked numbers. Ballpark number is below 100. That is nothing.
Why is it even there?
I mean, I'm sure.
When you know it's such a violent...
I mean, it's not like there is any big business there for a long period of time.
Why is there even a small business?
I mean, that you have to ask the business people. I don't know. I don't know why there is a small business.
No, I'm not holding you accountable.
No, but there are like familial connections through marriage, through other things, that some of the population ultimately moves on different countries. But
look, Syrians are rushing to Europe, and Indians are going to Syria for what?
But a lot of Indians moved out of Syria when the first phase of the civil war started. And they never went back.
Why are they still there? See, if Syrians themselves are out of Syria, what are Indians doing in Syria?
I genuinely don't have an answer to that. But out of the 90, for example, about 20 are known to be working with the UN. So you bring that down to 70. Now, what the other 70, 60 odd are doing, I have absolutely no idea. Best to ask them, I guess.
So how should India look at Syria, apart from making very meaningless statements, frankly?
I mean, look, India has maintained good ties with Assad, actually. As we talked before, we had regular communications with them even during the peak of the civil war. Our embassy really didn't close down. In 2015, it closed down for some time because of the warfare being just too close to the embassy compound. But we've maintained a contact with the Assad government, regularly, despite the odds. And that has nothing to do with the Assad government per se.
We will maintain with whosoever
is
now.
there. No, but there is this, and I'd like to address this very briefly. There is this sort of very old hangover that the Assad government was very secularist in nature. Hence, the Indians really supported Assad's outreach. Now, I'd argue if they were that secularist in nature, I don't think the rebels there would be such a massive pushback from the public, or there would be such euphoric scenes from the public. So ultimately, even if they had that veneer of being secularist, like Saddam Hussein did, right? So even today in India, if you talk about Saddam Hussein, people say, "Oh, he was a secularist." But if you are still gassing your own people, if you are still killing your own people in prisons that are known as...
You can kill in a secular way. You don't need to kill, for instance, the Sunnis only.
No, but as I said, Assad was an equal opportunity offender.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, but ultimately, the quest for justice, the quest for domestic issues came much before any ideation of what a secularist organization or regime is. That's a very far-flung view of things, right? That we can say it sitting here because we are nowhere near. So it's very palatable to us. But if you see from a distance, if the Syrians are sort of revolting, if people of that country are revolting, that has nothing to do with his secular credentials. It has what he's done in the state.
Okay, so last set of questions. So I'm going to read out a part, which is this. There is a take no prisoners approach to revolutions in this region. And for instance, we saw this in Tunisia, Egypt and Yemen in 2011, the Arab Spring. We saw the uprising in Bahrain in 2012. We also saw protests in Algeria, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Morocco, Oman and Sudan around that time. We witnessed minor protests in Mauritania, Saudi Arabia, Djibouti, Western Sahara. We saw this in Pakistan decades earlier through military coups. We saw this in Afghanistan. And we are watching it happen in Bangladesh today in 2024, where the old leaders have to run for their lives. Okay? Doesn't this create space even within the autocratic community, of which all these people seem to be members, to have an institution which sort of catalyzes or allows for a peaceful change of power? Now, democracy is the easy way out. I mean, it's a proven way and it does very well. most of the time. But they can have their own way. Any transition of power is violent.
It
and,
is.
Saddam was hanged and Bhutto was killed, and and yet the autocrats think that it will not happen to them, and therefore perhaps they start building some sort of a dynasty. So what is about this region? Is it religion? Is it the region? Is it politics? What is it particularly about this region? I mean, I know you can give me an example of North Korea also, but let's leave that aside. It is very in your face in this area.
It is, but it's always been like that, right? Even if you remove the state structures that came after the two world wars, or how the colonialist powers redrew boundaries and decided this is a straight line Syria, this is a straight line Iraq, and so on. The ethno-religious tensions were always there. They were suddenly just boxed into geographies, arbitrarily, in most cases. And when you do it arbitrarily in a lot of cases, how the common sort of thread that we have seen in a region like Middle East is like that the trend of chaos and violence is usually suppressed by an autocrat. That there is one power worse than all the other powers, right? That
So it serves a purpose.
it serves a sort of purpose, yes, and has been. And if you see a lot of thinking over the past, some people do argue about this fairly openly. That if there is a worse power suppressing the other powers, and you can just talk to that one worse power, it's more easier for you as an external actor. But it never works internally. Internally, it's a pressure cooker. The CT will blast one day. And that has happened repeatedly in most cases. And when that happens, then the world finds itself, especially the democratic world, finds itself that, oh, the Syrian revolution has started, we have to support it. What are we going to say? Are we going to say that the autocrat actually maintained a level of semblance for us because it became for us to easily deal with it? You can't say that. So we have to support it, which is what happened in a large section of the Arab Spring thing. And the Arab Spring was a very small event happening in Tunisia being lit up the entire region. That showed you the amount of stress the region was in.
Has that stress gone now?
I think that stress, because the Arab Spring, in my mind, and this will be contested, of course, was not a very, very successful event, broadly speaking. Largely because, yes, the people expressed themselves, but there were very limited political alternatives in place for them to represent the people. There were no figureheads. Revolutions happened, but they happened sporadically. There was no leader. And everyone liked the fact that there's no leader to this revolution. It's a people's revolution. But once the revolution wins, hypothetically or otherwise, once the revolution wins, the dictator is brought down. Who sits on top? That you have to decide very quickly, because there's another dictator waiting somewhere on the side to sit again. And in a lot of those cases, that happened. If you see in Egypt, they pushed for elections after Hosni Mubarak, and the Muslim Brotherhood won. And suddenly, for a lot of Arab states, the US, the West, they were like, that's not palatable. But people voted for the Muslim Brotherhood. Right? So it totally depends on what kind of pressure is being let out. And then it becomes, is the alternative palatable to the others or not? This region has always been stuck in that trap. That one leader is gone, the other is come. The people have decided, but I don't like that leader. Ideologically, he's dangerous for the region. So it's never just the people's will. It's the people's will meeting their country's will, meeting the region's will. It's a graph that you can't capitulate any of these parts. You would like to, you would wish to. If you were in, let's say, for example, if you're in Europe, you can do that. Why? Because they're all largely different states and they're living within their
So isn't there
structures.
any self-interest of these autocrats? They know that they have ousted somebody, they have killed someone and taken that position. Tomorrow it's going to happen to them. Does that sense of and I've shown you so many examples.
Yeah.
Don't you get a sense, it may happen to you? So
They all know that. But see, if you are an autocrat beyond a point, you get completely drunk on both money and power. You surround yourself with people who are only going to tell you what you want to hear, which is what happened with Assad, I'm presuming. That his people around him said there's nothing wrong. These people tried to, mount an offensive against us. We destroyed them there, sir. Not an issue. And you'll be like, of course, the army is working. That delusionment can travel across the board. Because everyone across that board is protecting their behind. And when the time came, there was no one there. So even for Assad, it's a probability at some level. It was only a week ago or 6 days ago, he realized, wait.
This is serious.
This is serious and these guys have been feeding me absolute nonsense. So that's a full probability because everyone around that power structure is also in there for power and money. Everyone has self-interest. So if even at that time, the immediate circles that one surrounds themselves with says that, look, I have an escape plan as, let's say, an advisor to Assad. I'm mobilizing that, he'll take care. So everyone, disperses on their own interests while feeding the same sort of interest bogey to everyone around them at that point of time when it was beneficial to everyone.
I'm going to conclude with a sentence. On 31 August 2015, Lakhdar Brahimi, who is an Algerian United Nations diplomat, he served in the Arab League as a special envoy to Syria until 2014, said this: everybody had their agenda and the interests of the Syrian people came second, third, or not at all.
Yep.
To me, this is the tragedy of Syria.
I think it's well said.
Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much.
Kabir. And I know this is a moving story.
It is.
And it's moving so fast that we may have to drag you here again next week. Thank you for joining us on the Rising India podcast.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you for watching. Namaskar.